Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I'm president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Randal Pinkett, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of BCT Partners. As one website biography writes, Dr. Pinkett is, quote, famously known for his role in The Apprentice, end quote. Now, our speaker's television accomplishment is certainly a significant one as well as a source of fame, but when you review Dr. Pinkett's background and experiences, you will see that there's a whole lot more in the story about this man. Dr. Pinkett was born in Philadelphia and raised in New Jersey, where he currently resides. After graduating from high school in Hightstown, New Jersey, which I have to note is an appropriately named city considering Dr. Pinkett's accomplishments, I also will point out for those listening in Hightstown, I know it doesn't have an E in it, but I thought I'd use that anyway. He attended Rutgers University, where he obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering, served as captain of the track and field team, on which he participated as a high jumper, long jumper, and I read an occasional sprinter as well, and received USA Today College All-Academic First Team and NCAA Academic All-American honors. After graduating from Rutgers, Dr. Pinkett attended Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and earned a Master of Science degree in computer science. He thereafter attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, where he earned a Master of Science degree in electrical engineering from the School of Engineering and a Master of Business Administration degree, or MBA, from the Sloan School of Technology. After earning his 2 master's degrees, he continued to study at MIT's Media Laboratory, earning a Doctor of Philosophy in Media Arts and Sciences. During this lengthy and impressive academic experience, Dr. Pinkett worked successively at AT&T Laboratories, Lucent Technologies, MBS Educational Services and Training, LLC, which he founded, and the Inner City Consulting Group in Kansas City. In 2001, he founded BCT Partners, a consulting firm based in Newark, New Jersey, specializing in program management, information technology, and public policy. He was associated for 3 years with Access One Corporation, a joint venture between BCT Partners and Washington, D.C.-based One Economy Corporation. And it would be a major omission for me not to expand on my earlier remarks and add that in 2005, Dr. Pinkett did not get fired and, in fact, was hired by Donald Trump as the winner of Season 4 of television's The Apprentice. Dr. Pinkett's numerous awards include the National Society of Black Engineers Entrepreneur of the Year Award, the National Urban League Business Excellence Award, the Information Technology Senior Management Forum's Beacon Award, and recognition by USA Today as one of the top 20 scholars in the United States. He has been featured on several nationally televised programs, including The Today Show, Live with Regis and Kelly, Nightline, and Larry King Live. He has served as spokesperson and board member for numerous organizations and is the author of several books, including most recently Black Faces and White Places, 10 game-changing strategies to achieve success and find greatness. So I am pleased and honored to present on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland, Dr. Randal Pinkett, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of BCT Partners.
I'd like to thank Paul Harris, your president of the board of directors, for the introduction. I want to thank the City Club for this podium because it can go up. And so I'm gonna
Usually it's not a problem.
not every podium can do that. I appreciate that. To Jim Foster, your executive director, and certainly to George Frazier of FrazierNet and SuccessNet, who's situated here in Cleveland. George is seated there and was instrumental in arranging for me to be here as part of a broader partnership between his organization and the City Club that's bringing speakers like myself to this forum to hopefully exchange and dialogue and ideas. So I want to thank George. Please give George a round of applause for his role in that regard. Now, I will be talking about my latest book, Black Faces in White Places, which is quite the provocative title. I've had quite a number of interesting reactions to the title of the book and the imagery that it conjures and the implications of its message. It's co-authored by me and my collegiate roommate and business partner, Jeffrey Robinson, Dr. Jeffrey Robinson, is a professor at Rutgers Business School now. He and I have been working on this project for the past 5 years. And needless to say, the phenomenon of being a black face in a white place is what I'll speak to, but more importantly, what it suggests about race relations in America, why we should care to some extent, and what we believe, Dr. Robinson and I believe should happen for our country to move in a different direction. And I'll be providing examples of some of the efforts that we've seen from our research in bringing the book together that we believe are very promising and very insightful and very encouraging about the kinds of things that need to be happening in that regard. Needless to say, I have been a black face in many white places throughout my entire life. And what it means is being one of the few or one of the only persons of color in some predominantly white environment. Arguably, the backdrop for my story, what set the stage, was certainly the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, which allowed black children to be educated in the same classrooms as white children, and then leading to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Housing Act of 1968, where my parents decided in 1973, given the options that were therefore afforded to them, that we would move from the urban community, predominantly black community of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to the predominantly white community of East Windsor and Hightstown, New Jersey, where we were one of a literal handful of black families to move into that neighborhood, to integrate that school system. And myself and my older brother were very much kind of at the forefront of families who had the opportunity to make decisions that benefited from the legislation of the 50s and the 60s. And so that trajectory followed my life's trajectory. I became a black face in a white place in Hightstown and East Windsor. I went on to Rutgers University, a predominantly white institution. I attended Oxford University, once again, not seeing many people who looked like me. Went on to MIT and saw even fewer people who looked like me. And now, as an entrepreneur, in the business arena, sitting at boardrooms for more often than not with people who do not look like me. And so the challenge of being the only one, of being one of the few, is twofold. One is forming an identity in an environment where you see very few reflections of yourself. And in many ways, almost defining yourself in a vacuum. Second, if you look to the latter stage of one's life or career, is trying to wrestle with the extent to which race influences career opportunities when, again, there are very few people who look like you. You know, in the words of Roland Martin, the journalist for CNN who wrote the foreword to the book, it's being a modern-day Jackie Robinson, you know, a trailblazer of sorts, a modern-day trailblazer, perhaps less prominent than Jackie Robinson, but certainly equally important in your own unique way. And this is what led Jeffrey and I to write the book. First, to share our experiences of having been through these varied environments. Second, to offer proactive strategies for African Americans and for all Americans to level the playing field and to inform that discussion based on interviews with other prominent African Americans who had been in that same situation. So we talked to people from a variety of backgrounds and walks of life. Angela Glover Blackwell, a noted nonprofit leader. Kevin Powell, an activist and author. Roland Martin, the journalist for CNN. Majora Carter, a well-recognized environmental activist. Benjamin Jealous, the president of the NAACP. Don Thompson, the president of McDonald's, who I had no idea at the time that the president of McDonald's was a black person. I met him at a conference. I said, you're black. And he said, so are you. We interviewed Deb Elam, a senior executive at General Electric, Hill Harper, a noted author and actor with CSI New York. Otis Moss III was one of our interviewees who succeeded Jeremiah Wright at Trinity in Chicago. Mayor Cory Booker of the city of Newark, my home city, and others. The list goes on and on. Second, to kind of offer the insights from their experiences, my experiences of being a black face in a white place. And then third and finally, to shed light on this phenomenon, not only for those who find themselves in these circumstances, but also, which are surprisingly all too common in 2011, but to also highlight an issue that I believe is very much reflective of the issues our country still faces at the nexus of race relations. And it is this third reason behind why we wrote the book that I will speak to this afternoon, which are perhaps most eloquently captured in the lyrics to a song which I'm going to have played for you. So I'll recite the lyrics to you. It was Lauryn Hill. All right, somebody knows what I'm talking about. Everything is everything. And the lyrics that were played a moment ago said the following: I wrote these words for everyone who struggles in their youth, who won't accept deception instead of what is truth. It seems we lose the game before we even start to play. Who made these rules? We're so confused, easily led astray. Those are the lyrics from Lauryn Hill. And the lyrics speak almost to the core of the challenge of being a black face in a white place. I wrote these words for everyone who struggles in their youth, who won't accept deception instead of what is truth. Much like my struggles in East Windsor and Hightstown of trying to define myself in a vacuum. Lauren speaks very poignantly to how we all endeavor to find where we fit in, how we all endeavor to find our place in society. To the second part, it seems we lose the game before we even start to play. Who made these rules were so confused, easily led astray, that we all play in a game or compete in a game. The game of politics, the game of business, the game of education. And regardless of the game that we compete in, African Americans can lose the game before we even start to play as a result of the constant negotiation between defining ourselves and society's attempts to define us in an American culture where race has and continues to be such a salient and polarizing issue. That W.E. Du Bois, who defined the challenge of the 20th century as the color line, would be just as accurate to define that challenge for the 21st century. In fact, the book that arguably is the precursor to this book that we've written is a book by a gentleman named Ellis Coase, who writes for the Washington Post. He wrote a book in 1993 called The Rage of a Privileged Class. You know, to Lauren's words in the song, we can be easily confused, easily led astray, and in my words, easily frustrated, easily disillusioned, and easily enraged by the very challenges of trying to find how we reconcile that identity crisis I described a moment ago. Ellis Coase, in his book, The Rage of a Privileged Class, subtitled, Why Do Prosperous Blacks Still Have the Blues?, interviewed dozens of accomplished African Americans of the generation that preceded mine and found this recurring theme of frustration, of playing by the rules and doing everything that was expected of them, but yet still being denied opportunity. He then changed the name of the book a year later in 1994 from The Rage of a Privileged Class, Why Do Prosperous Blacks Sing the Blues, to The Rage of a Privileged Class, Why Are Middle-Class Blacks So Angry? And this begins to encapsulate the phenomenon that I speak to. But let me go a little deeper. The phenomenon that we heard in the interviews and in my experience of being a black face in a white place is the following: being better educated, better equipped than any generation before you, but feeling the need to work twice as hard and be twice as good to overcome twice as many obstacles at times as your counterparts. That good is often simply not enough. Sometimes being perceived as if you speak for the entire black community. If you're late, we're all late. If you're wrong, we're all wrong. If you're right, you're the exception. And while there are spoken and unspoken rules to your game, the rules are often differentially applied, differential consequences for the same mistakes, differential outcomes for the same performance. In other words, you can observe a double standard for reasons you can't quite always put your finger on. And as a function of that, we tried to distill this phenomenon into what we describe in the book as the 4 dimensions of being a black face in a white place. 4 core questions that you can wrestle with either consciously or unconsciously. 4 issues that being in that context give rise to. The first dimension is that of identity. Asking the question, who am I? How do I define myself? And hopefully, do I define my identity, my culture? Do I regard my culture as an asset and not a liability? The second dimension of meritocracy, wrestling with the question, can I be judged on my merits? Am I being evaluated fairly? If I work hard and play by the rules, will I be equally rewarded like others? The third dimension of society, asking the question, is society colorblind? Does society value my diversity? Recognizing that, in my opinion, a post-racial society is not the goal, because a post-racial society does not see my color. And I want America to see my color. In fact, what I want America to see is to celebrate my color, that it needs not be diminished nor denied, but celebrated. And the fourth dimension is opportunity. Do I have equal opportunity to fulfill my destiny? Is the playing field sufficiently level to allow the possibility and the possibility of what I have been called to do? That if I was born to be president of these United States, is the playing field sufficiently level to allow that reality to manifest itself? And so I believe these dimensions, this phenomenon, is at the core of race relations in America. But the fact is that the challenges stemming from race relations in 2011 are not overt, but they are subtle. We're not talking about separate but equal, or fire hoses, or police dogs, or refusing to being served at a lunch counter, all of which were easily discernible. Today we're talking about much less observable dynamics, lower expectations, stereotypes, barriers to relationship building, differential power, differential perceptions, and as mentioned earlier, differential rules. These issues can be much more difficult to articulate, to navigate, much less to mediate, because they are rooted in perceptions, in biases, in prejudices, in assumptions, in privilege, and even in ignorance. And while the challenges may be subtle, the manifestation of these challenges is very real and observable, from the distribution of wealth in our country, to our country's standards of beauty, to the demographic breakdown of corporate America's executive elite. Race continues to be a force to be reckoned with in 21st century America. And while African Americans can sometimes overestimate rather, the influence of race, which we can, and whites can sometimes underestimate or ignore the influence of race, which can happen, the fact is that there are still some very discernible disparities that one can't help but attribute to race. Just one example. As we all know, the glass ceiling was coined in 1986 in an article in the Wall Street Journal, at the time highlighting the barriers that women faced in corporate America, and then moving on to embrace the barriers that all walks of minorities face in corporate America. At the time, the Glass Ceiling Commission was formed by the U.S. Department of Labor in 1995. About 2.5% of corporate executives were African American, 2.5%. 10 years later, in 2005, after all of the progress that had been made over the decade, that minorities had greater representation in the population, increased economic wherewithal, near parity between our representation in the population and the representation in the workforce, that African Americans are roughly 12% of the population, 11% of the workforce. When that same study was revisited in 2005, the numbers had moved to an incredible and alarming, unbelievable 3%. 3% over a decade. All that progress and not a scintilla of movement on the needle. So to get to the real core of the issues that we face today, it's beyond legislation. It's beyond corporate diversity statements or policies. It's beyond increasing the number of diverse images on television. The next bastion of improving race relations and leveling the playing field has to do with how we interact and communicate with one another, to eliminate the walls of misunderstanding. I believe one of the single greatest threats to our democracy is the circles and the walls that we are building up around ourselves that only create deeper divisions within our society. What am I talking about? I'm reminded of a talk by Elif Shafrak, a well-regarded storyteller, who said one of the surefire ways to kill something is to build walls around it. For example, if you dry up the area around a blemish, it will dissipate. If an army can fortify its position around its enemy, it is almost sure to achieve victory. And if you sufficiently segment the human soul from contact with others, it will diminish. Elif reminded me that we all live in some kind of a social and cultural circle. We're all born into a certain family, a certain race, a certain ethnicity, a certain class, a certain nation. But if we have no connection whatsoever with the worlds outside the one that we take for granted, then we can suffer the equivalent of a social and cultural death. In her words, our imagination might shrink, our hearts might dwindle, and our humanness might wither if we stay too long inside our cultural cocoons. And sadly, the divides within our society are only growing. The haves versus the have-nots, the wealthy versus the poor, the rich versus the rest, the old versus the young, black versus white, inner city versus suburban, gay versus straight, Americans versus foreigners, Democrats versus Republicans, agnostics versus believers, Fox versus MSNBC. And perhaps the most long-standing historical divide, Coca-Cola versus Pepsi. As evidence of how we're deepening our segregation and not expanding beyond our circles, it's interesting to note that since desegregation efforts have all but formally ended, the percentage of African American students attending a predominantly minority school has steadily increased since desegregation. That in 1974, about 63% of blacks attended a predominantly minority public school. Today, that number is well above 72%, and it continues to go up. The danger of what I'm calling communities of the like-minded is that we tend to associate with people who are like us. As a result, we can be easily prone to producing stereotypes and assumptions about those who are not like us. That we can easily cast projections onto those outside of the very communities that we belong to. And the irony of that is that as our country continues to diversify, as America becomes a majority of minorities by the year 2050, if all that does is drive us deeper into our communities of the like-minded, then not only do we undermine the benefits of our diversity, which have always been the strength of America, but we also further compromise our country's competitiveness. Because in the absence of real dialogue, real interactions, and real understanding that breaks down the walls that separate us, our inequalities will persist, and even larger segments of our population will be denied opportunity because the playing field is still not level. So the solution is not blacks learning more about whites, whites learning more about blacks. The solution is everybody learning more about everyone else. Woo. And not losing cool points in the process. I try to be cool. That was not cool. I know, right? That's the first. I think playing music was the first and knocking on the bell was the first. So to offer some thoughts and recommendations from the work we did with Black Faces in White Places, it's all under the banner of this quote from Jean Riboud, who said, if you want to innovate, to change an enterprise or change society, it takes people willing to do what is not expected. People willing to do what is not expected. Solving these issues is going to require doing what is not expected, doing something differently. It may require sacrifice. It may require stepping outside of our comfort zones. And it may require a little extra effort, a little extra outreach so that we can begin to tear down these walls. I'm going to give you 4 recommendations that are in the book. The first is to establish more spaces for us to interact and dialogue across lines of difference. Exactly what the City Club of Cleveland stands for. That the creed of this club begins by saying, I hail and harbor and hear persons of every belief and party. For within my portals, prejudice grows less and bias dwindles. That we must form more physical spaces, more joint ventures, more joint organizations, more joint partnerships that fundamentally are geared toward crossing lines of difference. What FraserNet and SuccessNet are doing with the City Club is a shining example of exactly the kind of partnerships that need to be developed. My challenge is that that activity continues to see the diversity of Cleveland reflected in this room as these dialogues unfold. That's the challenge to both FraserNet and to the City Club, that the diversity is reflected in this very dialogue. Another example from the book, the journalists of color here in the U.S. 4 organizations: the Asian American Journalists Association, the National Association of Black Journalists, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and the Native American Journalists Association, formed an organization that is jointly organized called the Journalists of Color Incorporated. In their words, it is a strategic alliance advocating news coverage about people of color and aggressively challenging its organizations at all levels to reflect the nation's diversity. The name of the organization is called Unity. It represents more than 10,000 journalists of color. And perhaps most interestingly is every 4 years, rather than each of the 4 organizations organizing a separate national conference, every 4 years, all 4 organizations come together and do a joint national conference. Think about the power that lies in 4 organizations coming together to co-organize, to co-strategize, to co-dialogue, to co-interact around the issues that affect them all. That is another example of exactly what is needed in terms of forming the kinds of relationships and partnerships that fundamentally cross lines of difference. I think about it like I think about a marriage. They say that marriage is grand and divorce is 50 grand. Or maybe 100 grand for this audience. Or maybe more. The point being that we've got to not just come together, but we've got to stay together. That once we form these marriages of sorts, they're not easy to do. We've got to continue to work them and avoid the divorce. Second, piggybacking off my first point, we must identify common ground to therefore focus on common issues. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that we all have common issues, but I am bold enough to say that while there are many issues that divide us, there are a growing number of issues that we share in common. We would all agree that our educational system in America is a common issue. Time magazine, when they had their cover story on schools, they cited that 1 out of 3 public high school students won't graduate. That's not black public school students, it's not Latino, it is American public school students. 1 in 3, according to Time magazine. Our environment is most assuredly an issue that affects us all. We are 6% in America of the world's population, but we generate 35% of the trash. 35% of the world's resources we consume in this country, and we are 6% of the globe's population. That is an issue that affects all of us. And our high rates of incarceration across the board affects us all. In 2008, more than 1 out of 100 adults in the U.S. was in prison or jail. That's an issue that affects us all. And so we must identify these common issues, capitalize on them, that we can then organize together, which also begins to break down these walls. I'll give you an example from the book. When we interviewed Benjamin Jealous, who's now president of the NAACP, his former role was a program manager at Amnesty International. Post 9/11, as we're all aware, racial profiling became a much more heightened issue, moving beyond minority communities to other communities, including Arabs, Muslims, Persians, and others. In his role at Amnesty, Ben Jealous built a synergistic coalition of organizations representing different minority groups, different ethnicities, different religions, including blacks, Hispanics, Arabs, whites, Muslims, Native Americans, and Asians, that included 100 organizations nationwide. A quote from Benjamin. He says, when you're a black American, both in the American context and the British context, everyone's expecting you to come in talking solely about your group or only capable of being an expert on the impact on black people. So the fact I was willing to listen, engage, and pay attention to the problem as it related to Muslims and Arabs and Persians and Native Americans and Southeast Asians empowered me to be successful in what would have otherwise been a very hostile context. And so they organized national hearings and research and released a report, and which ended up in legislation, the point being that they came together for an issue that affected them all. The last 2 points, so we can get to questions. Third, acknowledge and then address the issue of race explicitly without taking it for granted. That when I did Leadership New Jersey, we had specific seminars on the impact of race as it relates to leadership. When I was in the Rockefeller's Next Generation Leadership Program, we had specific modules and seminars around how race has an influence in American society. As I look at what is happening here with FraserNet and the City Club, and we talked about this a moment ago, it's having specific dialogues specific series around race and how it unfolds in our society. Fourth and finally, and this is where I'll get personal. Last but not least, I'm reminded of a recent article by L.Z. Granderson that reminded me that each and every one of us must do a better job during conversations about race of listening and not just hearing. It's kind of, listening is kind of like the teacher in Charlie Brown. Wah, 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 wah. You hear the sound, that's listening. Hearing, by comparison, hearing requires our undivided attention before formulating our thoughts. The good news is that I believe as a society we are having more dialogue about race. We are less afraid to talk about race. But the bad news is that we've got lots of hearing, in my opinion, and not enough listening. We must engage in listening and engage in dialogue that allows us to be forthcoming and transparent about our views without fear of summarily being labeled a racist on one side or a sellout on the other, being labeled prejudiced on one side and Uncle Tom on the other. It's no longer talking, it's hearing and listening such that we can move past where we'd like to be to reveal the uncomfortable truth about where we really are. In conclusion, achieving progress in the 21st century means asking the hard questions about whether we are all willing to be at the front lines of achieving equity in our society. It means moving beyond our comfort zones in meaningful ways that transcend what is easy, convenient, or superficial. It means dismissing plurality and diversity and multiculturalism and multiracialism for their own sake, but rather pursuing these ideals with the hope of a more equitable balance of resources, wealth, and power that ultimately benefits us all. It means taking off the rose-colored glasses that can prevent us from seeing that while we've made progress, we've still got tremendous work to do. And so I invite you to visit the website for Black Faces in White Places at redefinethegame.com. Redefinethegame.com, where we are launching a campaign to really spark dialogue and, more importantly, spark action around the very issues I've described to you. I will close with this, getting back to Lauryn Hill's song, Everything and Everything. I think she actually summarizes my outlook also eloquently. I won't play the sample. I'll just articulate it to you. The chorus after the opening lyrics that you heard says the following: after winter must come spring, change it comes eventually. That's what she says. I would play it, but I'm running out of time. The key phrase, after winter must come spring, change it comes eventually. I believe we are still in the winter of race relations in America. But I believe that change will come eventually and we will make progress and it will be made along the lines I've described. But we will only be successful if we embody this final quote, that we are not meant to see through each other, but to see each other through. That we're not meant to see through each other, but to see each other through. So let's see each other. Let's see the beauty of the colors that constitute our society. Let's commit to doing our own small, medium, or large part to improve race relations, level the playing field, and above all, not see through each other, but see each other through to create a society that is not post-racial, but one that is post-racism. God bless you, and thank you again for having me here at the City Club. I'm going to sit, right?
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening, with an emphasis on that word listening, to a Friday forum featuring Dr. Randal Pinkett, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of BCT Partners. We'll return to our speaker in a moment for our traditional City Club questions, and we'd ask you to start formulating your questions now and respectfully request that you keep them short and to the point so that we can get as many in as possible. Members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums, and we certainly hope that everyone listening will join the City Club in the coming year as we celebrate our 100th anniversary. We're 99 years old in October, and we're going to have a year-long celebration, and hopefully everyone in this room and beyond will participate actively in it. And we welcome all of you here, and to those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC, and our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. On Wednesday, May 25th, the City Club welcomes Ray Petering, Executive Administrator of Fish Management and Research at the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, who will discuss the invasion of Asian carp in the Great Lakes. Next Friday, May 27th, the City Club welcomes Steve Wormill, author of Justice Brennan, Liberal Champion. Now, to make reservations or to order a CD or DVD of today's program, please call 1-888-223-6786 or 216-621-0082. We are very pleased to welcome guests today at tables hosted by the law firm Baker & Hostetler and Medical Mutual of Ohio. Thank you for joining us today. Today's program is the Colleen Shaughnessy Memorial Forum, made possible by a special memorial gift from Colleen Shaughnessy's friends and family. Joining us at the head table today is Joe Tegreen. Mr. Tegreen, will you please stand and be recognized? Thank you for your support. I'd also like to acknowledge George Frazier, who's been acknowledged several times today, seated here at the head table, and for the strong partnership between the City Club and SuccessNet, which was responsible for today's outstanding program. We are also pleased to welcome students to our program as part of our student program. Our student program is generously supported by a grant from the Law Foundation. Today, we welcome students from Cleveland School of Science and Medicine and New Tech at Garrett Morgan. Will our students please stand and be recognized? Thank you for joining us today. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Program Director Carrie Miller. I don't see Carrie, so maybe, oh, there's Carrie. And Membership and Marketing Manager Heather Sikora. First question, please.
Dr. Pinkett, I so respond to your observations and your conclusions, and I wish life hadn't taught me some other elements. I've spent my life in the civil rights movement and helping minorities get into the suburbs before the law. And I also worked on committees to disperse the poor. And now my grandson, who has been raised in an integrated community his whole life, as well as my children, he talks about what's happening in his school. And he said most, I didn't say all, most of the black students do not apply themselves, confront authority of the teacher. He has black friends and so on, but he is very, very discouraged with the attitude amongst many, many black students. And he just is beside himself what to do about it. Do you have any suggestions?
Easy first question. And let me make sure I'm clear. Your son, is he a teacher or is he a student? Your grandson, my apologies, is a student, and he's seeing this in his peers, correct? Well, my advice would be actually to your grandson. We talked about this last night. I was here yesterday evening with a separate program, but I believe there's tremendous power in the peer group. Because peer pressure can be both positive and it can be negative. We often describe it in the context of negative influence, but I think we have a responsibility to not just help our children to do what's right, but to help them to help their peers to do the same. I tell young people all the time, you show me your friends and you show me your future. Show me your friends and you show me your future. And so if we can create a culture amongst our young people where our young people are taking a proactive step in creating that culture of excellence, of dedication, of hard work, of an ethic, I think that acknowledges that parents can only influence that environment up to a certain point. And so it's therefore our responsibility to empower them to help create the very environments that we are trying to create themselves. So my advice to you would be that you talk to your grandson to advise him on what he can do to be an example, to be a role model, and in some ways to even be an influencer in shaping the very peer culture that he's a party to. That would be my advice.
Dr. Pinkett, and I noticed that you're from Newark, New Jersey, and that you're president of a company there. Recently, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg invested millions of dollars with Mayor Cory Booker in the community of Newark, New Jersey. First of all, is your company involved in this partnership? And if you are, to what extent are some of the programs that you are involved in, and what are some of the goals?
We're not directly involved. I could say loosely, and I mean very loosely, just aware of what's happened between Zuckerberg, Mayor Booker, and Governor Christie. I was more involved with Cory's administration, Mayor Booker's administration, when he first took office. I chaired his transition team and developed a transition plan for Mayor Booker. Since then, in our role as a company in Newark, we've sought to do business with the city, which means we don't advise the city on its agenda or its policies, et cetera. So we've not been integrally involved. I only know what I've heard through my travels within the city of Newark, that they're now trying to figure out exactly how to structure this in a way that, because Newark schools are controlled by the state. They're not controlled by the city, including the superintendent is appointed by the governor. And so they're trying to now think through, is there going to be a reorganization of responsibility and authority around how this money is governed between the governor's office, the mayor's office, and the philanthropic entities that might benefit from the money as well. So that's still being determined right now, and I don't know what direction it's going to go.
Thank you, Dr. Pinkett, for coming in. I actually had two questions because I read your book, and if anyone didn't get the book, you have to get it because it's a very good book.
I'll invoice. You can invoice me later.
But
you read Black Faces in My Places?
I brought it here.
Okay.
Yeah, I got it here.
How long ago did you get it?
I got it 3 days ago, and I'm halfway through. So it's a very good book. It's a good book.
Honest answer.
But in the first part of your book, you talked about identity, and I thought that was something that you really didn't get a chance to touch on today. And a specific example in the book is when you say you give speeches like this, and there'll be an African-American leader, and they'll kind of come up to you afterwards and say, good job. And so my question is, as it relates to identity, because even in the black community, we still have a lot of wealth. I mean, in your book, it talked about how, I guess, $800 billion runs through the African-American community, which is a lot of money. And so I guess my question is, what would you say to black leaders as it relates to once they become a Dr. Pinkett, how do they actually help the next generation and propel them? And then my second question would be, as it relates to entrepreneurship, what advice would you give people who, let's just say, they don't want to play the corporate game and they want to go out on their own and start their own companies or businesses in order to provide that social that social impact that takes away from African Americans or even minorities, for that example, having to kind of go through the traditional corporate realm?
Okay. To the first question, and as a backdrop for those that didn't have the benefit of the book, when I talked about identity and people approaching me, it was in the context of saying something as it related to race or issues, et cetera, and then them coming to me afterward and saying, really appreciate what you said, but I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't have had the inclination to address the issue in the way that you did and as directly as you did. All well and good. And then the Apprentice finale was another good example. When I stood up to Trump, people said, oh, great move, but I wouldn't have done it. So to your point, and we talk about this in the second half of the book, you'll see, we talk about the 3 Fs. And we talked about this last night, that when you're confronted with an issue around race or challenge, you've got 3 choices. The first is to take flight, is to run. Say, these folk are crazy. I'm not going to deal with them. I'm going to go someplace else. And sometimes that's a legitimate decision. Second F is to forego the issues. I'm not going to deal with that now because I don't have any authority, any standing, any wherewithal to address the issue. I'll address it later, perhaps when I'm in a better position to do it. Also legitimate. The third F is to fight, to do what Malcolm X said, if you stand for nothing, you will fall for anything. And so the message to leaders, as to use your words, but I would say to all at some level, is that I believe we have a responsibility at some point to look back on our careers and say that we fought for something. If you just roll around the halls of corporate America or public school systems or nonprofit organizations, and all you do is take flight and forego issues, on and on and on, progress is predicated on people fighting for something. That's the only way progress is made. And if we acknowledge that somebody fought for us to have opportunity, then we have an obligation to fight for somebody else. These young people that are here this afternoon, that's our responsibility. That's our responsibility. So to your second question, on the entrepreneurship side, I can say to those on the fence, I believe we all have a calling and a passion. Oftentimes we go a traditional route thinking that that's what we should be doing when it's not what we want to be doing. And so if you're wrestling with, I'm in a corporate job, but I really want to be a business owner, all I can say to you is what Nike has been saying for years. Just do it. Just do it. Take the leap of faith. There's never a perfect time to do it. There will never be a perfect time to do it. But if it's what you believe in, then what Oprah said is true. If you love what you do, you never work another day in your life. And I was lucky to take that leap at an early age where I had little to lose. But you're never old until your regrets outnumber your dreams. You're never old until your regrets outnumber your dreams. So you're never too old or too young to take a leap, to do what you're called to do.
I guess I have some experience myself with being a black face in a so-called white place. My question relates to so much of networking takes place in recreational activities and the non-professional sports like basketball and football. Have you any observations as to why there are fewer people of color participating in things like sailing and rowing and equestrian sports and other things that are not considered predominantly of color sports?
Right. That's because we didn't grow up sailing and rowing. And I say that to be partly facetious, but it's a legitimate question in the sense that, and I've seen this in business. Business is all about relationships. It's where it begins and it's where it ends. And those relationships are developed in social settings. Bars, clubs, golf courses, sailings, country clubs, vacation destinations. I think there's two parts to your question. One is, have these things been traditionally a part of our culture? Traditionally, no. Now, having acknowledged that this is where the deals are done, where it all goes down, are we willing to put ourselves there? The answer is yes and no. That there are some of us who are willing to move out of that comfort zone, either because they see opportunity or because from their lived experiences they're more comfortable putting themselves in that situation. But then there are others who, A, aren't comfortable because they grew up in a black neighborhood, went to a black school, went to an HBCU, and that's just not what they're accustomed to. But they can still be challenged by individuals like yourself or like me to say, you can be comfortable there too. And it might require some professional development. It might require other preparatory activities. But we must be explicit that that's places that we need to be. And then we have to challenge ourselves to get there. And I think now here's an interesting dynamic. When Obama became president, all of a sudden there's all this talk about reporters learning basketball. No, it's true. I don't know if you saw the article in the Washington Post. Because they wanted to get opportunity to play on the court. So it's interesting how the dynamic can shift. In all seriousness, how the dynamic can shift very quickly depending on who's in power. So while I may be running to the golf course, there's somebody who looks like somebody else who's running to the basketball court. So that's why I say as our country diversifies, it's not about me learning more about whites or whites about me. It's about all of us learning more about each other because the diversity of our country is creating a whole new dynamic in all those regards, including those very spaces you described a moment ago.
Dr. Pinkett, I appreciate your knowledge and thank you for your candor. I work in the executive search space, and as I'm meeting with CEOs and HR executives, I often hear the lament that they are interested in expanding their the diversity of their leadership, but they can't find any qualified people of color, particularly African Americans. So my question to you is, what strategies might you offer to companies, first, to evaluate their own corporate culture, to analyze its receptivity to diverse leadership, and second, what might you suggest in terms of recruitment strategies?
Very good question. In terms of assessing their culture, I don't think that's difficult. I think you can talk to individuals that are there to understand what their experience and observations have been, particularly those who've navigated the environment successfully, so to speak, to understand what have been the barriers that they've faced, or those who have exited the organization to ask what were the reasons underlying why you took flight from that very environment. I don't think that's difficult. I think the second part of your question around what's the advice and the strategy, I think part of it around recruiting is investing in pipelines and not recruiting from pipelines. Because the problem is most corporations recruit diverse talent. They don't invest in pipelines for diverse talent. Much different approach. Recruiting is a zero-sum game. If I get 10 this year, that's 10 less for you. If I'm investing in a pipeline, I'm creating more individuals for everyone. The challenge with the investment is that everyone sees it as a tragedy of the commons. No one sees their responsibility to invest in the pipeline. I'm not going to see an immediate return on the investment. If I invest in a high school program to help increase the number of accountants, then I'm not going to see the return on that for 10 years. So it's not my responsibility. I'll just recruit. I'll go to the HBCUs or the schools that have large black populations, and I'll try to get as many as I can and say, that's my obligation to the diversity effort. No, it's not your obligation. Your obligation is, if you're serious about it, to invest. I think that's the message that's been missing in the very conversation, is that if you haven't been able to find anybody, that's the problem. There's no one there. So what are you doing to create more of what you're looking for, not for today, but for 10 years from now? That would be my advice.
Dr. Blanket, just a few moments ago, you mentioned President Obama, and he certainly is the epitome of the title of your book, Black Faces and White Places. Lately, there's been a certain amount of opposition to his policies, a great deal of it coming from Southern senators, Southern congresspeople, and recognizing the history of those states which for a long time had very severe laws against minorities, including blacks. To what extent do you think some of the opposition against President Obama today reflects the fact that he is a black face in a white place?
Good question. The interesting part about the question is that Obama has been somewhat of a litmus test for the very issues that I've described. That some, as I said in my remarks, might overestimate the influence of race and how he's been evaluated and perceived, and some might underestimate that very dynamic. Safe to say from my vantage point that it is most assuredly a factor in how he's evaluated and how he's perceived. I think the birther issue, and it's interesting, and I think to get to your question, I'll use an example of a conversation I had recently with Donald Trump. As we are all well aware, Trump was very outspoken on the birther issue, followed that up with criticisms or questioning the legitimacy of Obama's Ivy League education, then subsequently made a statement where he said that he has a good relationship with the blacks, which was then subsequently followed by a defense against claims of racism by saying, well, I can't be a racist because I hired Randal. That's what he said. I hired Randal, so how could I be a racist? So I called him, I said, Donald, you've got to understand how what you're saying and what you're doing is A, being perceived by others, and B, and I think he got that part, but the part I don't know if he necessarily got was I think you also have to take a moment to understand where that's coming from. Like, why are you so outspoken on the birther issue for Obama? Why are you questioning, when we've never questioned a sitting president's access to an institution of higher education, why are you questioning the man's legitimacy for having gone to Harvard? Because underlying that, in my opinion, is privilege. And the challenge with that is that privilege creates a difficulty in seeing how it's affecting your behaviors. You know, people say that privilege is like bad breath. The people who have it are the last to know. And so it's difficult to have, it was difficult to have the conversation without taking it to that level, but to get to that level, we've had to have an awareness of the fact that the level even exists. And so I think that is the very challenge that we face in even mediating a conversation about what is the influence of race and how President Obama has been evaluated, how he's been perceived, how he's been challenged, and on what issues. Is someone legitimately having an issue with his policy or his position, which is legitimate, or is there something underlying that? Here we go again. I got too many gestures. Is there something underlying that? That perhaps they're not even aware of. And that's why the very dialogue that I'm advocating is the only way to get down to that level. It's the only way to get there. A policy won't do it. A diversity statement won't do it. Only dialogue will get you there. Gotta move that.
It's not the first time. It's actually really close. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Dr. Randal Pinkett, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of BCT Partners. Thank you very much, Dr. Pinkett. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.